What would you do if you walked into a crowded market and saw your dead brother, someone you buried almost 20 years ago, standing in front of you? That's exactly what happened to Angelina Narcisse in rural Haiti in 1980 when she came face to face with Clairvius, the sibling she had mourned in 1962. He carried personal knowledge only he could know, and even bore a scar he claimed was from a coffin nail. How could a man be declared dead, buried, and yet appear again after nearly 2 decades? In this story, we'll examine what he said, what researchers uncovered, and why opinions remain divided. Some point to cultural forces, others to chemistry, and the clash between those explanations only makes the mystery deeper. To understand how events reached this impossible moment, we need to go back to the day Clairvius Narcisse was first declared dead. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, your body powerless, while your mind remained sharp.
On April 30th, 1962, Clairvius Narcisse admitted himself to the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Deschapelles, Haiti. He was seriously ill, suffering from fever and an unusual weakness that soon escalated to fits of violent coughing and the frightening expulsion of blood. Within days, his condition slipped beyond the reach of care. On May 2, 1962, 2 attending physicians examined him and officially pronounced him dead. For his family, who had gathered by his bedside, those words carried a finality that no one thought could be challenged. They accepted what they were told. Clairvius was gone. Following Haitian custom, plans for his burial moved swiftly. The heat and climate rarely allowed for drawn-out wakes, so funerals often occurred within 24 hours. His relatives and neighbors lit candles around his body through the night, offering prayers and songs in remembrance. By morning, his coffin was sealed and carried to the community cemetery, lowered into the earth with solemn ritual. The thud of soil against wood marked what everyone believed was the close of a life. For the family, it seemed that grief and memory were all that remained. But this account raises a troubling question. How could a man be sealed in a coffin, buried under soil, and yet meet his sister alive nearly 2 decades later? Some explanations point to natural toxins with the power to mimic death. Researchers studying Haitian zombie cases have identified traces of marine life, particularly pufferfish, in ritual powders prepared by buckers or sorcerers. Pufferfish contain Tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin that blocks nerve signals and can paralyze nearly every muscle in the body. In some cases, victims appear lifeless. Breathing becomes so shallow as to be undetectable, the heartbeat faint, the skin unnaturally cold. If tetrodotoxin had been used on Clairvius Narcisse, it could explain why physicians, acting on what they detected with their instruments and experience, believed him dead. Yet even in such paralysis, the brain may remain awake and aware. For the person within, every detail of the deathbed scene might be absorbed in silence. The murmur of grief, the prayers rising over the body, the sound of nails closing a wooden coffin. Some researchers suggest tetrodotoxin can create this locked-in state, though others caution that recreating such conditions reliably would be enormously difficult. A dose too strong would kill outright, while too weak a dose would fail to immobilize fully. From Narcisse's perspective, if he had indeed been paralyzed rather than dead, the burial itself would have been the beginning of a harrowing experience. Imagine hearing earth falling onto the coffin lid, voices receding as loved ones walked back toward the village, then the suffocating silence that followed. To remain conscious yet powerless in such a moment stands as one of the most unsettling possibilities modern science has proposed. Still, this remains a hypothesis, rather than proven fact, a theory that only adds layers of uncertainty to his story. For his family, meanwhile, there was never any question of deception or confusion. They trusted their own eyes, the word of doctors, and the rituals of burial that had carried countless others to eternal rest. In their belief, Clairvius was dead, and in their memory, he remained so for the next 18 years. Grief settled into their daily lives until time dulled the immediacy of loss. Nothing suggested that their acceptance of his death would ever be challenged. And yet, nearly 2 decades later, that certainty collapsed without warning. When a familiar face emerged in a crowded market in 1980, what his sister saw forced her to confront the impossible. A man they had buried long ago was standing in front of her. For Angelina Narcisse, the shock of recognition was not immediate acceptance. In that crowded market, confronted by a man who claimed to be her brother, she hesitated. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just a resemblance, a familiar face among strangers. 18 years had passed since Clairvius Narcisse was buried, and the mind can play tricks when faced with something impossible. Yet as she listened, the doubts began to unravel. The turning point came when the man called her by a childhood nickname. It was a name spoken only within the family, one that no outsider could have known. That single word pierced through layers of disbelief, and the moment weighed heavily on her. It convinced Angelina that she was not speaking to a stranger, but to the same brother she had mourned nearly 2 decades earlier. Later, as other relatives arrived, each tested him with private questions about their family history, names, locations, memories of trivial arguments and small habits. His responses matched every time. The accuracy of his answers left little room for chance. He also carried a mark that unsettled them deeply. On his body was a scar, and Narcisse insisted it came from the coffin nail driven through the lid during his burial. Whether or not that account could be independently verified, the family accepted it as corroboration. For them, it was evidence that aligned too closely with his story to dismiss. Between the private memories, the childhood nickname, and the scar, their suspicion gave way to a grim realization. This man was indeed Clairvius Narcisse. With recognition, however, came emotions more complex than relief. Angelina had her brother back, but the sight of him alive forced her to relive the certainty of losing him. She felt torn between gratitude and unease, comforted by his presence, yet horrified at what it implied. To embrace him meant confronting the fact that everything they had once accepted as final, his funeral, his years in the earth, was now called into question. The family's acceptance did not come lightly. They pressed him with memories from different stages of life, pushing back against the possibility of deception. Each time, his mannerisms, speech, and knowledge aligned with the brother they remembered. Reluctant at first, they gradually came to terms with the fact that he was neither a look-alike nor an imposter. He was who he claimed to be. The shock of that realization did not fade quickly. This was not just an extraordinary reunion. It was an encounter that unsettled their understanding of life itself. The return of Clairvius Narcisse left his family with questions that could not be answered simply by recognizing him. If he had not truly died, what had happened to him? Where had he been all those years and under whose control? Was this a story of medical error or something far more disturbing? Angelina and the others began to understand that the explanations might not come from within the family at all, but from what he himself had endured after his burial. What Narcisse described next took his story far beyond the moment of reunion. He claimed that life did not end with the grave, but continued under circumstances more terrifying than death itself. According to his account, what followed after that impossible reunion belonged to what many in Haiti describe as the world of the living dead. Narcisse said that after his burial, he was exhumed by a bokor, a Haitian practitioner often portrayed as a sorcerer who could both heal and harm, and was taken against his will. From that moment, he described experiencing a state of extreme loss of agency, where his actions no longer belonged to him, but to someone exerting control. In popular media, the word zombie usually conjures images of reanimated corpses staggering mindlessly in search of flesh. But in Haitian tradition, the meaning is starkly different. A zombie is not a predator, but a victim. It is a person stripped of autonomy and condemned to forced servitude, often as a punishment. Within this cultural framework, zombification was seen as something worse than death, not simply the cessation of life, but the erasure of self and community identity. For Narcisse, his story was framed as an ordeal built on this definition, one that blurred the boundary between living and dead in a way that felt deeply symbolic. Narcisse claimed he was transported to a sugar plantation after being raised from the grave. There, he said he labored alongside others believed to be in the same condition, alive in body, yet rendered powerless in spirit. The details of his account carried haunting echoes of Haiti's history of slavery. To exist as a body reduced only to work, without freedom, mirrored a national memory that remained raw and painful. His testimony suggested that zombification was not just a supernatural tale, but a lived embodiment of cultural trauma, reinforcing the understanding that in Haiti the deepest fear was not biological death, but social death through loss of identity and control. Central to his story was the claim that his submission was chemically reinforced. He reported being given preparations believed to contain Datura, a plant known to produce delirium, hallucinations, and disorientation so severe that victims lose the ability to separate reality from dream. He also described being subjected to a controlled diet, one that excluded salt. In Haitian belief, salt was associated with restoring awareness and linkages to the self, so withholding it carried symbolic and practical weight. Taken together, these conditions created what he described as years spent in a haze, obeying the commands of his captors, while his awareness flickered dimly beneath the fog of confusion. This captivity, however, did not last indefinitely. According to his account, an unexpected rupture ended the cycle. While he and others toiled on the plantation, one of the so-called zombies turned on the Bokor and killed him with a hoe. In the aftermath of their captor's death, Narcisse and the others were no longer restrained. At that point, the tight hold the Bokor maintained over them disappeared, and the group dispersed back into the wider world. For Narcisse, this was the moment where he began a path that eventually led to his reemergence 2 decades later. His story also raised questions about the layered meaning of death in Haitian society. If his body had not truly expired, then in a biological sense, he had not died. But socially, he had been erased, ceremonially mourned and buried, remembered only as someone gone. This duality carried immense symbolic weight. To the community, he was dead because his role in family and society was severed. To himself, survival meant existing in a fog of obedience that offered no escape. In that equation, zombification was experienced as the theft of both body and identity. Haiti's past gave the narrative an even sharper edge. Generations had endured enslavement under colonial powers, leaving scars of a system where people were treated as property. To many, the zombie represented a continuation of that loss. Enslavement extended beyond the grave itself. The fear was not of rotting corpses hunting the living, but of becoming a laboring body devoid of freedom, bound forever to another's will. Narcisse's testimony aligned with this cultural meaning, where the horror lay in being alive yet stripped of humanity. By the time his account circulated globally, it was framed not as a tale of resurrection, but as testimony to ordeal. In Haiti, resurrection celebrated life restored. What Narcisse described was something else, years in which his personhood was suspended, his voice erased, and his existence reduced to function. To listeners unfamiliar with Haitian culture, his story seemed supernatural. Yet locally, it resonated with long-standing fears and beliefs, reinforcing the idea that losing selfhood was the cruelest punishment of all. But if his description sounded like folklore, it also posed a question for science. How could such an ordeal be explained physically? Were there real substances capable of producing a state mistaken for death, followed by prolonged confusion and servitude? Could natural science offer a framework for what appeared to be an impossible return from the grave? Once Narcisse's case gained attention, this question motivated researchers to examine the methods attributed to Bokors more closely. Reports suggested these practitioners used powders with the power to mimic death so convincingly that even trained physicians might be deceived. If there was a key to this mystery, it might lie in the ingredients hidden in those preparations. When investigators collected and analyzed samples, they found no single fixed recipe, but a consistent pattern across regions. Among the mixtures were fragments of human bone, irritant plants with tiny stinging hairs, and, most significantly, dried pufferfish. The powdered remains of these fish contained Tetrodotoxin, an extremely potent substance known to interfere with nerve activity. In plain terms, the toxin blocks signals between nerves and muscles. As a result, the muscles, including those controlling breathing, can stop moving, even as the mind remains awake. To doctors relying on touch, sight, and simple instruments, a person in this condition might appear lifeless. No speech, faint breath, weak or absent pulse. Yet somewhere inside, awareness could still linger. This possibility sparked interest in the late 20th century when psychopharmacologist Nathan Klein sent a graduate student, Wade Davis, to Haiti to investigate cases like Narcisse's. Davis reported that powders he collected often contained pufferfish toxins, among other substances, and he argued that tetrodotoxin was central to inducing a death-like state. In his work, Davis also noted the role of Datura, a hallucinogenic plant, applied as a paste to maintain long-term confusion and submission. Together, these substances offered a biological explanation that aligned with parts of Narcisse's testimony. However, Davis's findings quickly provoked debate. Critics argued that toxin levels in the powders were inconsistent and often too low to have the described effects, while others suggested his conclusions leaned too heavily on anecdotal accounts from informants. This division left the scientific community deeply split over how much weight to give his work. Even setting aside controversy, chemical explanations alone cannot address every part of the story. Narcisse reportedly spent years laboring in a mental fog, and something more than initial paralysis had to sustain that state. Here, researchers pointed again to Datura. Known to cause hallucinations, memory loss, and extreme confusion, it could strip a person's sense of time and place, leaving them unable to resist orders. Added to this was a psychological dimension. If someone in Haitian culture believed they had become a zombie, the weight of that identity itself could reinforce compliance. The idea that one's soul had been stolen, or that one no longer belonged to the living, could shape behavior as powerfully as any drug. The convergence of biology and belief is what makes the case so unsettling. The physical effects of tetrodotoxin and Datura can undermine both movement and perception, while cultural meaning explains why victims interpret those effects as zombification. Within that framework, science does not cancel out tradition, but helps explain why it feels so real. The person inside the paralysis may know what is happening around them, but lack control to stop it, while the community reads the signs as evidence that the individual has crossed into the realm of the dead. Still, experts caution that this explanation has limits. Measuring the dose of a toxin like tetrodotoxin is dangerously difficult. Too little has no effect, and too much is lethal. Critics of Davis argue it is unlikely that Bokors could reliably control dosing with the precision needed to mimic death without killing. Others argue Western fascination with a biomedical zombie powder risks flattening a much richer cultural practice into mere pharmacology. Beyond the chemicals, the fear of zombification rests deeply on what it means socially. To lose not only bodily freedom, but also social identity. For Narcisse himself, explanations about toxins and drugs do not account for why he, of all people, faced this fate. The chemistry might provide a how, but it does not reveal the why. His case cannot be separated from the human motives and cultural judgments that could condemn someone to such a terrifying existence. And that leads us to the next unsettling question. What kind of punishment was zombification meant to be, and who had the power to impose it? In Haitian tradition, zombification was not widely understood as a way to exploit labor, but as a form of punishment. To be transformed into a zombie was to be stripped of social identity and condemned to a state worse than death. Many local accounts suggest that disputes over land, inheritance, or social infractions, such as Narcisse's alleged refusal to give land to his brother, could become motives for such a fate. Within this framework, a Bokor did not merely act out of self-interest. Instead, their actions reflected broader community tensions, channeling grievances into an irreversible sentence. This punishment reached beyond the physical body. A victim's death was accepted by relatives and neighbors, their burial performed as tradition demanded. From that point forward, the living mourned, moved on, and treated them as gone. Yet the person continued to exist, alive in body but erased in every other way. They no longer had a name in the community or a role within the family. To live unseen and unrecognized amounted to social death, a punishment that carried profound weight in a society where belonging to a community was central to identity. In the case of Clairvius Narcisse, stories indicate that his zombification may not have come from the hands of an anonymous sorcerer, but from conflicts close to home. Land disputes were common in rural Haiti, where property often meant survival. Inheritance disagreements fractured families, and accusations could escalate into lasting resentments. Accounts linked Narcisse's ordeal to such a situation, suggesting that punishment was carried out not only through the knowledge of the bucker, but with the knowledge, or even the consent, of kin who felt wronged. These interpretations, while impossible to verify absolutely, underscore why zombification was not viewed merely as folklore, but as a channel for social enforcement. For those who faced the threat, the meaning was stark. The practice functioned as a warning. Step outside accepted norms, and the community could erase you. Unlike imprisonment, which implied eventual return, zombification symbolized permanence. You were dead to the world of the living, but condemned to remain alive, silent, and alienated. This boundary reinforced a powerful deterrent, not through official institutions, but through fear of cultural sanction. Belief was the mechanism that gave the punishment its force. If the community accepted that a Bokor had the power to strip away a soul, then the victim's status was already lost. From that moment, those who saw the person no longer recognized them as neighbor, sibling, or friend. They recognized only a zombie, someone emptied of identity. In this way, the collective belief sustained the practice. The Bokor's authority existed because the community reinforced it, and the victim's erasure became reality because people around them agreed it had. This authority gave Bokors a dual role in Haitian society. They were healers and punishers, guardians of order as much as wielders of fear. Their reputation derived not only from ritual powders or herbal knowledge, but also from the conviction that they could enforce consequences when social boundaries were crossed. That authority reflected a broader cultural memory. Haiti's history of enslavement left deep scars, and zombification drew directly from that past. The image of a person robbed of freedom, worked without recognition, and silenced in every meaningful sense, echoed experiences of slavery under colonial rule. Many scholars argue that zombification carried a symbolic power precisely because it revived these memories. The fear of being reduced to property, nameless and voiceless, haunted by historical trauma. To outsiders, these dimensions were often obscured. Western portrayals presented zombies as grotesque figures of horror, rotting bodies that attacked the living. Haitian understanding was something else entirely. The figure of the zombie was not a monster, but a reminder of social consequences, a moral warning that warned against selfishness, betrayal, or defiance. What international audiences consumed as spectacle, Haitians understood as a form of cultural justice. Clairvius Narcisse's story reveals how far that justice, whether imagined or enacted, could extend. His reported dispute over land ties aligns with local accounts suggesting that personal grievances could escalate into the most severe sort of punishment. For him, the sentence erased identity, severed family ties, and recast his body into silent servitude. His ordeal illustrated not simply the effects of toxins or rituals, but the power of belief to dictate reality. The image of Narcisse returning decades later was not just uncanny, it was a reminder of the weight that society itself can impose. His fate demonstrates that what was most feared in Haiti was not the loss of life alone, but the loss of identity within the living. Clairvius Narcisse's account closes with questions rather than answers. His ordeal highlights that death itself may not be the greatest threat. It is the loss of agency and recognition. Narcisse's case forces us to see that being declared dead by others, social death, can be a fate worse than bodily death. When we picture zombies, the most unsettling image is not the monsters of cinema, but people stripped of identity under the weight of belief and power. How would you respond if someone you buried years ago suddenly stood before you? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the Dreamland Express if you enjoy careful investigations into eerie mysteries. Was this a crime, a cultural punishment, or something else entirely?